Today we are looking at a case from the 20th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Madeline Webb was born in Stillwater, Oklahoma on the 3rd of June 1912. She was an only child, and her parents, named William and Vera, often spoilt their daughter, making sure that Madeline enjoyed a nice, comfortable childhood. At school, she loved to perform and would often stand up in front of the class, reading or singing. She also joined the performing arts group, known as the Glee Club. Teachers and classmates soon noticed that Madeline was a very good actress, and one of her teachers described her as being the most talented student she had ever taught. Madeline grew up to be a very beautiful young woman, and when she finished school, she went to study a degree at Oklahoma State University. Things then started to get a little more difficult for her, as her father died in 1930, and her mother was unable to provide her with the financial support she had previously enjoyed. But Madeline studied hard and graduated in 1933. After her graduation, she thought about what she wanted to do next, but it was a surprise to most people when she eloped with her boyfriend, named Ed Roy King, and got married. The marriage didn't last very long, and within a year of walking down the aisle, Madeline filed for divorce. Now focused on her future and wanting a new start, she told her mother that she was going to follow her dream of becoming an actress or a model, and was going to go to Hollywood. Her mother was very much against this idea, and thought that her daughter should stay in the small town of Stillwater. She knew that many young women hoped of becoming famous actresses and models, but she was very well aware that very few of them would ever fulfill their dreams of becoming a star. Madeline knew, however, that her father would have supported her. He had always admired her ambition and had considered her to be very talented. So in 1936, against the advice of her mother, she set off for Hollywood. Madeline soon discovered that trying to make it in Hollywood was extremely difficult, and although she was a very pretty young lady, there were many other beautiful women, all sharing the same hopes and dreams. She managed to get a few minor modelling assignments, but after 3 years without her big break, she left Hollywood and went to New York to see if she could find success on Broadway. Things were just as difficult in New York. Every role was sought by many beautiful and talented actresses, and although Madeline managed to get some work dancing and modelling, she made most of her income by working as a waitress. Life was becoming very difficult for her. She was now approaching her 30th birthday, and sometimes she wished she was away from the big city lights and back in the small, peaceful community of Stillwater. But Madeline didn't return home. Instead, she stayed in New York, clinging to the faintest hope of stardom. Then in 1942, she met a man named Eli Schomburn. In some ways, he was very similar to her, as he had also dreamt of fame and stardom. For a while, he had worked as a big band singer in a Long Island cabaret. When the club closed, he started working for his uncle, named Murray Herschel, in his jewelry business. The business, however, didn't have the best reputation, and when Eli was arrested, his wife left him, and he was left single and out of work. He tried again to find band work, but the competition was tough. But just when he thought nothing was going right for him, he met Madeline, and they soon became a couple. Madeline and Eli started to live together, but without any money, they spent their time staying in cheap hotels, which they would often leave without paying the bill. So with no work, no money, and nowhere to stay, Eli returned to his life of petty crime. Eventually, the couple ended up in a hotel called the Sutton. They registered using the names Mr. and Mrs. Leopold. Eli gave Madeline a diamond engagement ring and told her that his marriage was over and he would soon be divorced. He started to introduce her as his bride. Madeline was very much in love with Eli and seemed to believe everything he told her. Eli had a friend named John Cullen. He was a petty criminal who was often in trouble with the police. Both men were finding life hard. They could not find work, and the US economy was not doing well. The country had just entered the Second World War, and the bars and clubs were no longer attracting the visitors they had in previous years. Eli and John were no strangers to small-time crime, and in desperate need of some money, came up with a plan to commit a robbery. Eli remembered that Madeline had recently met a lady who was a patron of a theatre. She was 52 years old, and her name was Susan Reich. She was a daughter of one of the richest industrialists in Poland, and had arrived in New York on September the 5th, 1939, 4 days after the start of the Second World War. Eli considered her an easy target and worked out a plan to rob her. On Saturday, March the 21st, 1942, Susan's elderly aunt Eliza answered the phone in their apartment. A woman asked to speak to Susan, but she was told she was not in at present. So she asked Susan's aunt to relay a message. She said that she was the actress Madeline Webb, and that she had recently been married, so was inviting some of her friends to meet her husband, and had arranged lunch at her apartment in the Sutton Hotel, and she would very much like her friend Susan to join them. Susan's aunt gave her niece the message, and she made her way to the apartment where Madeline and Eli were staying, but she didn't return home. 2 days later, her husband called the police and reported his wife missing. Detectives interviewed Susan's husband and aunt, and then made their way to the Sutton Hotel. They entered the room, and lying dead on the floor, with her hands bound and her mouth covered with tape, was Susan Reich. A scarf had been tied around her neck, and a diamond ring and an expensive watch were missing. The lady who had escaped the atrocities in Europe had now been found murdered in a New York hotel room. A murder investigation was launched, led by the very experienced detective, Thomas Tunney. The hotel manager told him that the couple who were occupying the room had left the previous day and had not returned. They described Madeline as a beautiful lady in her 30s, and Eli as a tall, slim, well-dressed gentleman. The police presumed that the couple had used false names to sign the hotel register, so the search for the identity of the couple, who called themselves Mr. and Mrs. Leopold, begun. Finding their identity took far less time than Detective Tunney had envisaged, as after the newspapers had reported the story, and knowing that Eli's uncle Murray Herschel had been known to deal in stolen jewellery, the police paid him a visit. He told the police that he was aware that his nephew was planning a robbery, and after agreeing a deal with Detective Tunney, he gave the identity of Madeline and told him everything he knew about their plan. He said that he had agreed to get rid of the stolen jewellery, but he did not know they planned to kill Susan, and apart from agreeing to sell the items, had no part in the crime. The police obtained pictures of Eli from his police file and of Madeline from a modelling agency, and showed them to the staff at the Sutton Hotel. They confirmed that the photos were of the couple who called themselves Mr. and Mrs. Leopold, and the police then went about trying to track down John Cullen, Eli Schombrun, and Madeline Webb. Madeline and Eli were soon found in a hotel in the Bronx, and when their room was searched, the police found the victim's stolen jewellery. A couple of days later, John Cullen was arrested. The three of them were interviewed separately. Madeline told Detective Tunney that Eli never discussed his business with her, and she had no knowledge of the crime. She said she did not know that the money he made was from robbing people. Eli Schombrun and John Cullen also told the detective that Madeline knew nothing about their plan, but the police were not convinced. She was an intelligent lady with a university education and must have been complicit in the crime. Taking everything into account, they charged all three with murder. The trial generated a lot of press interest, and in court, Madeline didn't disappoint. As she entered the courtroom, all the eyes seemed to focus on her, a beautiful, graceful lady who was on trial for murder. She had at last found the fame and notoriety that she had sought for so long. but in a manner very different to that she had dreamt of. The story was certainly going to help sell some newspapers. She denied any knowledge of the crime, and both John and Eli confirmed her statement. But Eli's uncle said she was complicit and that Madeline had made the phone call, which was answered by the victim's Aunt Eliza. When Aunt Eliza was questioned, she told the court that she was certain that it was Madeline who had called, as the voice was the same. Madeline continued to deny that she had made the call or had any knowledge of the crime. Eli and John had already told the court that she had not made the call and said that it was made by Eli's uncle, Murray Herschel, who they said was very good at imitating a woman's voice. Eli added that he had sent Madeline shopping on the day of the crime, and in the hotel bedroom there was just the victim, himself, and his uncle. He said that John Cullen was not there either. He went on to tell the court that he had just planned to rob the lady, but his uncle struck her, committed the crime, then panicked, and then, when was questioned by the police, agreed a deal with them to frame the other three. When Madeline took the stand, she told the court that on the night of the murder, she had met Eli on the street, and he had told her that he had been locked out of the hotel because he had no money to pay for the room. This was not an unusual occurrence, so Madeline was not surprised by the news, and together they moved to another hotel. But Madeline didn't help her case when she started screaming at the prosecution attorney because she was uncomfortable with his line of questioning. Eventually, the prosecution conceded that Madeline was not at the hotel during the crime. However, they said that they considered that she was aware of the plan and equally responsible. The press were fascinated by the case, and Eli and Madeline seemed to play up to them by showing their feelings for one another throughout the trial, which was continually stopped as the couple shouted out words of support for each other. When the trial ended, the jury was sent out to deliberate. The press sat anxiously in the gallery, ready to report the verdict, and when the jury returned, it seemed to take an age for the foreman to say the words that they found the defendants, Eli Chambron, John Cullen, and Madeline Webb, guilty of murder. The foreman went on to say that the jury recommended mercy for Madeline. Judge Jonah Goldstein then sentenced Eli and John to death by way of the electric chair and sentenced Madeline to life in prison without parole. The press left the court in a frenzy, and the next day the papers were full of the story. Madeline was sent to the Westfield Women's Prison. At first she found life hard, and in the first 2 months she barely spoke to anyone and would spend most of her time sobbing in her cell. Eli and John were sent to Sing Sing Prison, where on April the 29th, 1943, Eli received his final letter from Madeline. He carefully read it before handing it to the warden to be destroyed, and then he and John Cullen were executed in the electric chair. As time passed, Madeline adapted to life in prison. She was a well-educated woman and started to spend her time teaching the other inmates, some who were unable to read or write. She also worked in the prison library and directed plays for the prisoners to perform. The prison superintendent, named Lillian Fish, said that Madeline had developed a wonderful way with people and a very deep and sincere interest in helping others. Madeline's lawyers petitioned for parole on the grounds that she had been reformed in prison, but the brutality of her crime meant that each time her parole application was denied. However, in 1967, parole was eventually granted, and Madeline left prison and returned to her hometown of Stillwater. She spent her time looking after her elderly mother, who had spent most of her savings on her daughter's legal fees. She also worked with local community organisations. Her mother lived into her 90s, spending the last 12 years of her life with her daughter. She died in October 1979, and 4 months later, on the 1st of February 1980, Madeline Webb died of cancer. She was 67 years old. She died proclaiming her innocence, never having admitted to any part in the murder of Susan Reich. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As per usual, please leave any feedback or comments you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case